You were told your government would protect you, that the white coat meant safety, that a study meant science, not suffering, but that's the thing about trust. Once it's taken, you don't get it back. Welcome to a world of closed doors and quiet files. A world where experiments aren't done in secret bunkers, but in plain daylight. This is 30 experiments the US government performed and then pretended to forget. Before we start, dim the lights, get comfortable, and remember, sometimes the monsters don't hide in shadows. Sometimes they wear stethoscopes. You wake up in 1932, in Macon County, Alabama. You're poor. You work the fields. You've never seen a doctor who doesn't look at you like a problem. So when men from the government show up, men in clean suits, smiling like Sunday preachers, you listen. They say you've got bad blood. They say they'll treat you. They say it's free. And in a place where nothing is free, that sounds like a miracle. You sit in a clinic that smells of alcohol and metal. The nurse, gentle, polite, draws your blood and writes your name on a card. You don't ask questions because you've been taught not to. Because you think this is help. Spoiler alert, it's not. The Tuskegee study wasn't an accident. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a 40-year-long lie, wrapped in medical language and funded by your own tax dollars. The Public Health Service wanted to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. Translation: they wanted to see what would happen if you caught a deadly disease, and they did nothing. They promised you medicine. They gave you placebos. They promised you care. They gave you spinal taps and empty bottles. They promised you decency. They gave you death. And the worst part? They kept watching year after year, generation after generation, as men like you grew sick, went blind, went insane, or passed it on to wives and children. All under the banner of science. Bad blood, they called it not syphilis, not infection, not betrayal, just bad blood. Something simple enough to fit on a clipboard and easy enough to forget. When penicillin became the known cure in the 1940s, the doctors knew. They had meetings, memos, discussions, and they decided to do nothing. You were still their data point. Still their subject. Still their evidence that nature runs its course. Congrats. You're helping your country by dying slowly. The study didn't end until 1972, 4 decades later, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. The public gasped. Congress held hearings. Apologies were drafted by committees. The president said, sorry. But you can't apologize someone back to life. Men died. Families shattered. Children were born with congenital syphilis, infected before they even opened their eyes. And the country moved on, pretending it was a lesson learned. Except it wasn't, really. Because trust doesn't heal like that. Because when someone says, it's just a small experiment, you start to wonder what that really means. You imagine the white building now, long closed, its walls still humming with secrets. You imagine the files stacked high, labeled confidential, the polite bureaucratic word for, we did something unspeakable. You imagine yourself there, sitting in that chair again, rolling up your sleeve while the needle gleams under the light. They tell you it won't hurt, and you almost believe them. You wake up in a white room. The clock on the wall doesn't tick, it hums. You think it's morning, but it could just as easily be 2 a.m. There are no windows to prove you wrong. Someone hands you a paper cup of water, smiles too politely, and says the words everyone dreads, for science. Forget what Hollywood taught you. No flashing lights, no sci-fi gadgets, no secret serum that gives you powers. Just a bunch of men in suits, a stack of government forms, and a bottle of LSD strong enough to make reality melt. This is MKUltra, where the mind wasn't sacred, it was just another battlefield. The Cold War has the world sweating bullets. Somewhere in Washington, someone whispers that the Soviets might be controlling minds. So, naturally, the only reasonable response is to try it first. You can almost hear the logic echoing in the conference room. If they can brainwash people, so can we. And just like that, a new program is born, with a name that sounds like a metal band and a budget that could buy a small town. CIA officers, chemists, psychiatrists, everyone wants a piece. They don't want to heal the human mind. They want to reprogram it. Congrats. You're not a person anymore. You're a test subject with a pulse. They call it behavioral modification. You'd call it losing your grip on reality. You're dosed without warning. In hospitals, in safe houses, even in your coffee at work. Sometimes you volunteered, sometimes you didn't. The CIA liked surprises. It made the data cleaner. And then the room starts to ripple. Walls breathe. Time stretches. You forget your name, your country, your reason for being here. The man in the corner writes everything down. His pen scratches like a heartbeat. He's not high. He's your handler. Across the country, universities join in. Grants are handed out like candy. Professors run experiments on students who think they're part of harmless psychology studies. No one tells them they've been turned into puppets for national security. And then there's Operation Midnight Climax, the part of MKUltra that sounds made up but isn't. Government-run brothels in San Francisco and New York. Hidden microphones. Two-way mirrors. CIA agents watching behind the glass as unsuspecting men trip on LSD poured into their drinks. Research goal? To see if you can extract secrets from someone mid-hallucination. Spoiler, you can't. But it made for great notes. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. Electroshock therapy turned up to 11. Sensory deprivation tanks that last days. Hypnosis layered over drug trips layered over more hypnosis. They wanted to find the perfect formula, the one that could erase memories, rewrite loyalties, build a soldier who obeys without question. A human robot. Instead, they built trauma, confusion, and a lot of destroyed lives. By the early 1960s, even the CIA started feeling squeamish. The director, Richard Helms, quietly ordered the files shredded in 1973. Years of work, gone in a confetti storm of classified paper. But some fragments survived, just enough for the public to glimpse the nightmare beneath the bureaucratic language. Subproject 68. Behavioral control. Enhanced interrogation. Nice, clean words for things that left people broken. One of the doctors, Ewan Cameron, up in Canada, believed he could wipe a mind clean and rebuild it from scratch. His patients came in for depression, anxiety, grief. They left with no memory of who they were. He called it de-patterning. You might call it erasing souls. Decades later, victims tried to sue. Most never saw justice. The government admitted, not guilt, but interest. A polite shrug in legal form. Because what's a few ruined lives compared to national security? You imagine the file room again, the one that survived the shredders. Inside, folders with names you'll never read. Notes scrawled in the margins. Subject responded well. Repeat exposure. Memory fragmented. You close the drawer quietly. It hums like that clock in the windowless room. Somewhere out there, someone probably still believes it worked. It's 1950 in San Francisco, and you wake up to the smell of salt in the air. The fog rolls in as usual, thick and pale, curling through the streets like it owns the place. People say it gives the city its charm. You don't know it yet, but this morning's fog isn't just moisture. It's an experiment. Somewhere out on a Navy ship in the bay, a group of men stand around metal canisters the size of milk jugs. They check their watches. The wind is right. Someone nods. Valves twist open, and a fine red mist drifts upward into the breeze, millions of microscopic particles, invisible once they leave the nozzle. You breathe in. Everyone does. Congratulations, you've just become part of Operation Sea Spray. The year is a paranoid one. The Cold War is new, invisible enemies are everywhere, and the word biological sounds like both promise and threat. The Navy wants to know what would happen if a hostile power released germs over an American city. Would people notice? How fast would it spread? Who would get sick first? They need a test city, somewhere dense, foggy, cooperative with the wind. San Francisco, the jewel of the coast, fits perfectly. The locals aren't asked for permission. Secrecy keeps things scientific. The plan is simple: spray a cloud of Serratia marcescens, reddish bacterium thought at the time to be harmless, along with an aerosol of fluorescent particles called Bacillus globigii, now known to cause infections in vulnerable people. Track how far it travels, how quickly it settles, and pretend nobody's watching. You walk to work. Maybe you stop for coffee. The cup feels warm in your hand. The fog sticks to your coat. Somewhere behind you, the ship USS Dahlgren glides quietly back toward port. The men on board are already writing in notebooks. Operation successful. Dispersion excellent. Within days, red pigmented bacteria appear on petri dishes set out across the city by Navy scientists posing as ordinary researchers. They're thrilled it worked. The microbes traveled miles inland. No alarms, no panic. The perfect invisible weapon. Except for one small detail, people start getting sick. At Stanford Hospital, a man named Edward Neal Jr. arrives with a strange infection. Doctors are baffled. The same red organism shows up in lab cultures. It's something they've never seen infect humans before. The patient dies of complications and no one connects the dots. How could they? No one told them there were dots. Across the city, a few others develop urinary tract infections and pneumonia with the same bacterium. The Navy's reports call the test no hazard to health. The files go into storage, stamped confidential. You go on with life, never knowing you inhaled government research. The truth doesn't surface until the 1970s, when documents are declassified and journalists start asking why the military used American cities as test sites. Congressional hearings follow. Officials admit that, yes, several open-air tests took place, in San Francisco, in New York's subway, over the Midwest. But they insist the bacteria were safe. People raise eyebrows. One senator calls it a breach of trust that can never be fully repaired. The surviving family of the man who died from infection sues the government. The case is dismissed. The court rules there's no way to prove direct causation. Science meets semantics, and semantics wins. Looking back, it all feels strangely mundane. No villains twirling mustaches, just men with clipboards doing math on wind patterns. They weren't trying to kill anyone. They were trying to measure. That's the part that keeps you up at night, the quiet efficiency of it. The calm reasoning that turns a city into a laboratory. You step outside again, decades later. The same fog curls over the bay. People still call it beautiful. You inhale deeply, and for a fleeting moment you wonder what's in it this time. You wake up in Guatemala City, 1947. The sun hasn't even cleared the rooftops yet, but the air already sticks to your skin. The smell of dust, sweat, and disinfectant mixes into something that doesn't belong anywhere near medicine. You've been told you're part of a health study, something about preventing disease. What you don't know is that the disease in question is already waiting for you. This isn't a hospital in the way you understand it. It's a field station, half clinic, half laboratory. White coats move between rooms with the confidence of men who know no one will question them. On paper, it's a public health project. In practice, it's a secret experiment funded by the US government and run with help from local authorities. The purpose? To test new ways of preventing syphilis. Because apparently, it's easier to infect people than to ask for volunteers. The idea came from the same public health service that oversaw Tuskegee. Only this time, they didn't want to observe the disease, they wanted to cause it. Soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, even sex workers, all labeled participants. None were told what was really happening. You're one of them. Maybe you're here because you were offered a checkup, or because someone said the army needed healthy men. Maybe they told you it was a vaccine test. They smile when they inject you, a practice smile that doesn't reach their eyes. You feel the sting of the needle. You think that's the treatment starting dot. Spoiler, it's the infection. In some cases, they didn't even bother with injections. They brought in infected sex workers and arranged visits with soldiers. When that didn't spread the disease efficiently enough, they scraped bacteria directly onto wounds, or dripped it into open cuts. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The reports called these variations in method. You'd call it something else. Within days, sores appear. Fever follows. The doctors note everything in neat cursive, detached and calm. They record symptoms, reactions, blood counts. They discuss ethics over lunch, probably. You lie there wondering why the medicine burns instead of helps. By 1948, hundreds of people are infected. Some are treated, most are not. The goal isn't to cure, it's to test whether penicillin prevents infection after exposure. To the scientists, you're a data point in a tidy column. To everyone else, you're disposable. The files later describe inoculation procedures and controlled exposure. It sounds clinical until you realize those words mean we gave people a venereal disease without consent. But paperwork has a way of making horror look organized. The study ends quietly in 1948. The files are boxed, labeled, and shipped back to Washington. No reports, no publications, no apologies. Everyone involved moves on to the next project. For decades, no one outside those offices even knows it happened. It isn't until the 2000s, over 50 years later, that a researcher at Wellesley College uncovers the documents buried in the archives. She reads the words, intentional infection. She reads the names of American doctors she's seen praised in textbooks. She realizes this wasn't some rogue project. It was approved, funded, and forgotten. When the news breaks, it sounds like a story from another planet. The President of the United States formally apologizes to Guatemala in 2010. A sentence or two on camera, a promise of accountability. But the people who were actually infected, most of them were already gone. You can't send an apology letter to the grave. You imagine the clinic again, its walls crumbling under the tropical heat. The same exam tables. The same rusted syringes. Somewhere, maybe, the old ledgers still sit, names written in fading ink. Beside each one, a number. Beside the number, a symptom. Beside the symptom, silence. You look at the record and wonder how many times the word volunteer really meant victim. You wake up in the atomic age. The newspapers say it's the dawn of progress, the era of glowing cities and boundless energy. They don't mention that the same glow can burn through skin, blood, and bone. You're told it's safe, of course. You're told it's for your country. And if the men in suits and white coats say so, who are you to argue? It's 1945. The bombs have fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world has seen what radiation can do, and suddenly, everyone wants to understand it. The US government launches a series of studies to learn how the human body reacts to exposure. It sounds noble, scientific, even necessary. The problem is that the participants aren't always asked if they'd like to participate. You're in a hospital bed in Tennessee, maybe Oak Ridge or Vanderbilt. You think you're here for regular treatment. Anemia, arthritis, something ordinary. You don't notice the clipboard in the doctor's hand that says, classified. A nurse smiles softly and tells you this injection will help. You nod. You're tired. The needle slides in. It stings a little. You have no idea it contains plutonium. The scientists record your name, your weight, your blood pressure, and the amount of radioactive material now inside your veins. They'll check on you tomorrow. They'll take samples, blood, urine, sometimes bone. They'll measure the decay inside your body like a ticking clock. You are the clock now. Across the country, other tests begin. Pregnant women at Vanderbilt are given what they're told are vitamin drinks. In reality, cocktails laced with radioactive iron. Children at institutions are fed oatmeal dusted with isotopes, part of a study on digestion. Cancer patients at hospitals in Massachusetts and California receive experimental radiation therapy, but the doses are far higher than anyone admits. Soldiers stand in trenches during atomic blasts, watching the sky turn white, told to face the explosion for data collection. No one is warned what this means in years. Your teeth glow faintly in the mirror, but you call it imagination. The official reasoning is simple: national defense. If a nuclear war happens, doctors must know how to treat radiation sickness. And besides, the scientists say, the subjects are terminal, disabled, or unable to consent. Those words make it sound tidy. They make the paperwork easy to file. No one writes down that you were a human being. The studies continue quietly through the 1950s and 60s. Dozens of universities and hospitals receive federal funding. Every report carries the same phrases: low risk, minimal exposure, valuable data. Behind those phrases are stories like yours, Tired patients wondering why the medicine burns, children feeling sick after breakfast, soldiers coughing up blood years later. The data, however, is excellent. Decades pass. The Cold War begins to cool, and so do the files. In 1993, a newspaper exposes the secret. A year later, the U.S. government declassifies hundreds of documents, reports detailing experiments on more than 4,000 people. There are hearings, cameras, apologies, and official phrases like ethical failures and deep regret. The scientists are mostly dead by then. Their reports remain, stored neatly in archives. Charts, graphs, and the kind of handwriting that looks calm even when it shouldn't. The victims' families sit in the audience, listening. One of them asks, did they even know what they were doing? No one answers directly. You picture the hospital again, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sting of antiseptic, the quiet conversation outside your door. Someone's writing in your file, not about who you are, but about what your body will teach them. The nurse smiles again, the same way she did the first time. Just one more sample, she says. You nod. You always nod. In 1954, the morning sky over the Marshall Islands turned the color of magnesium fire. The detonation, codenamed Castle Bravo, was the largest nuclear test the United States ever conducted. It was meant to prove that the hydrogen bomb worked, and it did, a little too well. The blast was roughly 2.5 times stronger than planners expected. What followed was a cloud of pulverized coral and radioactive dust that rose into the stratosphere and drifted east, toward inhabited atolls that were never supposed to see it. The people of Rongelap and Utrecht heard the explosion before they saw the light. Some thought it was thunder. A few hours later, a fine white powder began to fall from the sky, soft as ash and strangely beautiful. Children played in it. Adults brushed it off their skin, thinking it was snow. By nightfall, the burns had started, and the coughing. At the same moment, scientists hundreds of miles away began drawing up something called Project 4.1, an emergency study of human beings exposed to radioactive fallout. Officially, the project's purpose was to learn how radiation affected the human body so that future accidents could be handled more effectively. Unofficially, it became a field experiment written in real time, its subjects chosen not by consent but by geography. Medical teams arrived on the islands 2 days later. The islanders were evacuated, examined, photographed, and catalogued. Blood samples were taken, lesions measured, internal doses estimated. Notes were meticulous: the exact hour of nausea, the pattern of hair loss, the degree of exposure by age group. The scientists called it data collection. The islanders called it something else. Back on the mainland, the fallout became a matter of public relations. The Atomic Energy Commission assured reporters that everything was under control. The word accident was avoided whenever possible. Within weeks, the same doctors who had treated the injured were asked to prepare formal reports for the commission, clean, typed, and suitable for circulation. Their conclusions read like weather summaries: mild to moderate beta burns, transient nausea, recovery expected. The reality was slower. Years passed. Thyroid problems appeared, then cancers. Some of the children born after the test showed developmental issues. On Rongelap, food and water remained contaminated for decades, but officials repeatedly encouraged resettlement, describing it as safe enough. When the people returned, they began to fall ill again, and in 1985 they left the island for a second time, this time on a Greenpeace ship. For the researchers, Project 4.1 produced valuable data. Papers were presented at scientific meetings, dose-response charts were refined. In the logic of the Cold War, every number was a contribution to national security. Radiation biology advanced. So did the distrust of those who had been studied. In later testimony, government representatives maintained that the project had not been planned in advance, that it arose only after the accident. Yet early drafts of the document list Project 4.1 as part of the Bravo schedule, as though someone had anticipated the need for observations. Whether it was foresight or revisionist filing remains a matter of debate, but the moral weight is the same. Today, the Marshall Islands remain dotted with concrete domes and fenced-off craters. The lagoon at Bikini Atoll looks serene, turquoise and quiet, but Geiger counters tell another story. Generations have passed, and the descendants of the displaced still live on borrowed ground. In 2023, islanders petitioned again for cleanup funds and medical care, a reminder that fallout does not fade as quickly as memory. Project 4.1 sits in archives now, rows of folders labeled with words like clinical findings and population study. Reading them is an exercise in understatement. The language is careful, professional, and almost tender. The events it describes are anything but. At first glance, it looked like the clean side of Cold War science. No secrecy, no prisoners, no needles in the dark. Operation Whitecoat began in 1954 at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the same base where the United States tested its biological defense programs. The participants were volunteers, uniformed men, most of them in their early 20s, most of them Seventh-day Adventists. They didn't smoke, they didn't fight on Saturdays, and when the Army asked for test subjects to study disease instead of weapons, they said yes. The name came from the lab coats they wore, though the phrase, human guinea pig, floated around often enough. Each man signed a form stating that the experiment posed no undue risk. What undue meant was flexible. The project's purpose was simple on paper: learn how to protect troops against biological weapons. The Korean War had filled intelligence reports with rumors of germ attacks, and the Army wanted real data. To get it, they needed people who would stay in controlled environments, follow every instruction, and not panic when exposed to pathogens. The Adventist soldiers, guided by their church's endorsement of medical service, seemed ideal. They were tested for stamina and temperament, issued sterile uniforms, and placed in isolation wards. Each experiment focused on one microbe: Q fever, tularemia, sandfly fever, yellow fever, plague, or hepatitis. Scientists released controlled doses into sealed chambers or injected diluted cultures under the skin. Every temperature spike, every cough, every hour of recovery was charted with care. No one was coerced. That was the line the Army repeated, and by most accounts, it was true. The men could decline any trial. Many did. Others stayed out of a sense of purpose. If someone had to take the risk, better them than soldiers in the field. Faith helped too. Several volunteers later said they prayed before each exposure, trusting that God and penicillin would do their jobs. Inside the labs, the days blurred. Meals arrived on metal trays, sterilized and bland. Nurses came by with clipboards and blood pressure cuffs. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. The scientists wore respirators that made conversations sound mechanical. Outside, the Maryland woods hummed with summer insects, a normal world just beyond the quarantine fence. Most subjects recovered quickly, though not comfortably. Q fever, for instance, brought a week of high fever, pounding headaches, and aching joints. Tularemia felt like the flu but sharper, followed by exhaustion that could last months. The researchers logged every symptom and drew blood like it was currency. When recovery finally came, the volunteers posed for photographs, smiling, thin, and still a little pale. The official narrative called it a success. The Army learned how much exposure a person could survive, how vaccines performed under real conditions, and how long immunity lasted. The data shaped U.S. biodefense programs for decades. The volunteers earned commendations and, occasionally, a sense of quiet pride. They had done something risky without firing a shot. Later, critics asked obvious questions. Could true consent exist in a military hierarchy? Were the health risks fully explained? Did anyone know what chronic fatigue, lung scarring, or future sensitivity to infection might mean? The answers varied depending on which report one read. The official summary used the word minimal often, a bureaucratic comfort blanket over unpredictable biology. By the time the program ended in 1973, roughly 2,300 soldiers had taken part. No one died directly from the tests, at least none recorded, but the ethical debate lingered. The Seventh-day Adventist Church maintained that the volunteers acted honorably. Medical historians later called Operation Whitecoat an ethical gray zone done with unusual transparency, a sentence that manages to sound both praise and warning. Fort Detrick still exists, though its mission has shifted to vaccine research and biosecurity. A small museum display preserves the memory of the whitecoats, photographs of young men in starched uniforms, test tubes in hand, eyes steady. Visitors read the placards, nod politely, and move on to the next exhibit. Somewhere in those notebooks lies a single recurring line, written in tidy penmanship, subject recovering well. It says enough. You might imagine the military laboratory as sterile, quiet, and orderly. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland in the 1950s and 60s, was all of that, except for the faint, persistent tang of chemical agents and fear. Here, the U.S. Army conducted tests on thousands of soldiers to study the effects of toxic chemicals, from nerve agents like sarin and VX to hallucinogens designed to disrupt thought and perception. The goal was simple. If enemies could use them, America should understand them. The method less so. Most of the men involved were volunteers, soldiers told that participation was part of service or experimental duty. Some signed up out of curiosity, others out of obedience. They reported for long days in gray, windowless chambers, sometimes wearing protective suits, sometimes just their uniforms. The walls absorbed smells, ammonia, chlorine, bitter metallic notes, and the floors never seemed clean enough to erase the fear. They were exposed to mustard gas in small doses. They inhaled irritants that burned the eyes and throat. They were given potent hallucinogens meant to test mental resilience. Every symptom, from mild nausea to fainting, was recorded in precise logs. Heart rate, blood pressure, reaction time, cognitive tests, each detail meticulously noted. Instructors reassured the men that this was science, that it was temporary, that they were safe. Spoiler, the experiments pushed limits. Some subjects developed severe blisters or prolonged respiratory irritation. Others experienced panic attacks and paranoia after hallucinogenic exposure. Official reports emphasized that injuries were rare and temporary. Soldiers later called it a mix of boredom, curiosity, and genuine worry, the anxiety that came from knowing your body could be a chemical battlefield. The experiments weren't only about observation. Some tests were intended to determine incapacitation times, safe exposure limits, and methods for decontamination. Simulated attacks were staged with tear gas, irritants, and even combinations of multiple agents at once. The men were trained to respond, but also studied in how they failed to respond. Every failure was data. Every reaction became a line in a spreadsheet. Yet, unlike some other government programs, Edgewood's experiments had a strange duality. Volunteers could leave the project if they chose. They were paid, documented, and debriefed. But in the uniformed hierarchy of the military, choice can be complicated. Saying no sometimes meant standing out, and standing out was rarely convenient. By the 1960s, thousands of soldiers had participated in Edgewood Arsenal studies. Some were exposed to nerve agents, some to incapacitating agents, and some to experimental drugs meant to disorient or disrupt memory. The purpose was always framed as defensive, understand the enemy's potential weapons, develop countermeasures, and protect U.S. forces. The reality, however, was less clear-cut. Reports later revealed that long-term health effects had been underreported. Some veterans experienced neurological symptoms, cognitive decline, and chronic illness. By the time the Army declassified portions of the studies in the 1970s, public outcry focused not only on the chemical risks but also on the psychological impact of being a human test subject in the middle of secrecy and bureaucracy. Edgewood Arsenal remains a symbol of Cold War pragmatism taken to its extreme. The tests themselves, carefully planned, meticulously logged, and officially sanctioned, offer insight into a military culture that saw the human body as both asset and instrument. Soldiers often remarked that the data collected was precise, the procedures professional, but the experience left a subtle, lingering unease. It was a laboratory without a villain in a mask. There were just orders, chemicals, and the quiet realization that sometimes your nation expects you to be both observer and experiment. It's 1954, and somewhere in the deserts of Georgia and Florida, the U.S. Army is conducting an experiment that would make any entomologist equal parts fascinated and horrified. Welcome to Operation Big Itch, a test of flea dispersal as a potential vector for biological warfare. The goal is simple. Could fleas carrying disease incapacitate an enemy without a single bullet fired? The method is less simple. Fleas are collected, bred, and, in some cases, infected with a mild simulant of plague bacteria. Scientists package them in small bombs designed to open in midair, releasing clouds of jumping, biting insects over a controlled test area. Soldiers and technicians watch from a safe distance, or as safe as anyone can be when a flea can fly half a mile and land where it pleases. You walk past the test field. The ground smells of dry earth, metal, and insect repellent. Canisters of fleas wait in crates. Each insect is a potential agent of chaos. One slip, one gust of wind, and the experiment could stray into the town beyond the range fence. The scientists log wind speeds, temperature, and humidity, variables that decide whether the fleas behave like effective vectors or just hop around in confusion. They release the first batch. The insects scatter in a reddish-brown cloud. Tiny legs crawl over leaves, soil, and the occasional stray dog. Observers record everything. How far the fleas jump, how long they survive in the environment, how efficiently they could theoretically transmit disease. All the while, someone whispers that it's for national security. Operation Big Itch is part of a larger program. The Army wants to know if insects could be weaponized, silently delivered, and difficult to trace. Unlike chemical or nuclear tests, insects are unpredictable. Some die instantly. Others wander. Some are never found again. Yet each failure is data. Each tiny, biting creature is an experiment in mobility, survivability, and persistence. The soldiers participating are aware that this isn't entirely harmless. Fleas bite. Some subjects develop mild rashes or swelling, and the Army notes it in careful, detached language. Volunteers are told this is temporary, minor, and part of the study. Still, there is no guarantee that every flea will remain in the test perimeter. The insect knows no allegiance. By the time the operation ends, data has been collected on survival rates, dispersal distances, and bite frequency. The Army evaluates whether fleas could serve as a tactical weapon. In the end, the experiment demonstrates that yes, under controlled conditions, insects can be a delivery system, but the logistical and ethical concerns are enormous. Fleas are small, fast, and impossible to control completely. They could just as easily bite civilians or livestock. The public would never know about Operation Big Itch until decades later, when declassified documents revealed the extent of entomological testing. Newspapers ran headlines noting Army flea experiments, with a mix of horror and disbelief. Scientists debated the practicality, ethicists debated the morality. And the desert? Quiet once more, except for the occasional jump of a stray flea decades later, an unintended legacy of the Cold War. It's difficult to read the files and not marvel at the detachment with which the military approached the problem. The language is clinical, vector dispersal, host susceptibility, environmental survivability. Yet the subject, the flea, carries with it the unspoken reality of human involvement. People are bitten, measured, recorded. They are volunteers, yes, but the presence of unpredictability reminds them that even a small insect can become a test of resilience. In retrospect, the experiment is more absurd than sinister. Fleas as weapons? It sounds like a joke. And yet, it underscores a pattern that will repeat itself throughout Cold War science. The use of living beings, whether humans or insects, as instruments to explore hypothetical threats. It's 1955, and the U.S. Army is trying something new. After testing fleas in the desert, they look skyward. Mosquitoes. Tiny, winged, buzzing, disease-carrying insects that, in the right circumstances, could turn an entire area into a living laboratory of irritation and infection. Welcome to Operation Big Buzz, an entomological experiment that blends Cold War paranoia with the stubborn audacity of science. The goal is straightforward, if unsettling: determine whether mosquitoes could be mass-produced, transported, and released over a populated area, or at least a simulated one, without losing effectiveness. Could these tiny vectors survive, travel miles, and potentially spread disease? In short, could the mosquito be weaponized? The operation takes place in Georgia. Military technicians breed hundreds of thousands of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in controlled labs, marking them for tracking. Each mosquito is a test subject, just as much as the human population that might someday encounter them. At designated release sites, the Army unleashes the insects. They float upward, then scatter with the breeze, tiny red and black specks carried by wind and instinct. Soldiers observe from a distance, equipped with nets and collection devices. They track where the mosquitoes go, how far they travel, and how many survive. The data is astonishing. Even in open air, a significant number find hosts. The operation's success is measured not in harm caused but in survivability, dispersal, and collection rates. Nearby, volunteers are sometimes involved in monitoring, acting as bait for recapture without being harmed. Mosquito bites are inevitable, but the military ensures that the mosquitoes are uninfected. There is no disease, at least not yet. The point is to simulate what might happen if these insects were vectors for biological agents. Every bite is logged, every flight path measured. From a distance, the scene could almost be humorous. Men crouching in fields, waving nets, swatting at airborne insects, while thousands more float above in a dizzying cloud. Yet beneath the absurdity lies a methodical, strategic mindset. The military is gathering data, learning how the tiniest creatures could amplify the power of modern weapons. The experiment is part of a larger pattern in Cold War research. Small, seemingly harmless vectors used to model large-scale biological scenarios. Fleas, mosquitoes, bacteria, and spores, each studied with meticulous care, each documented as part of a contingency plan for national defense. The goal was never random cruelty. It was knowledge, precise, measurable, and morally gray. The files from Operation Big Buzz describe wind patterns, recapture rates, and survival percentages. They also contain notes on unexpected outcomes. Some mosquitoes went further than predicted, others returned to areas that were supposed to be safe zones. Nature, as always, has its own agenda, and the military was learning to measure it in blood-sucking increments. In later decades, when the documents were declassified, journalists described the operation with a mix of amusement and horror. Headlines read, "Army tests mosquitoes as weapons." Scientists debated the practical applications. Ethicists noted that although no humans were intentionally infected, the volunteers had still been used as living monitors in experiments they could not fully control. For the people involved, the experience is remembered quietly: hours in fields with nets, insect bites, and the odd sense that something small could carry massive potential. For the rest of us, Operation Big Buzz is a reminder that experimentation doesn't need grand explosions or flashing lights to be consequential. Sometimes, it just needs a mosquito and meticulous record-keeping. It's the mid-1950s. The Cold War is tightening its grip on the United States, and military planners are looking for ways to test the reach of chemical and biological agents over wide areas. Instead of fleas or mosquitoes, they now focus on the air itself: fog, mist, and clouds that can carry invisible particles for miles. This is Operation Dew, a series of large-scale field tests designed to study how aerosols disperse in the atmosphere. The experiments take place across the Carolinas and along the eastern seaboard. The goal is precise, almost clinical: release harmless bacteria or simulants, track where the particles travel, and calculate how quickly they settle or dissipate. In theory, this would help the military understand how a real biological attack might behave without the risk of actual infection. In practice, it means people breathe clouds without knowing it. On the ground, the mist is unremarkable. It smells faintly of wet earth, salt, or nothing at all. Residents see fog rolling in, obscuring the trees and the horizon, and go about their daily routines. They don't know that the Navy and Army have seeded it with Bacillus subtilis var. Niger, a bacterium chosen because it's easy to detect and supposedly harmless. Children play outside, cars move through the haze, and cows graze in pastures, all part of an unconsenting study in particle movement. From the observation posts, scientists take wind readings, map dispersion patterns, and collect air and soil samples. They chart every variable: temperature, humidity, wind speed, and topography. Even a minor shift in wind direction becomes a crucial piece of data. The men in lab coats scribble furiously in notebooks, recording what the human eye cannot see: an invisible cloud sweeping through towns, schools, and farms. For the military, the experiment is a success. They learn how far particles travel, how they settle, and how unpredictable the variables can be. Each test produces a wealth of data, later archived and classified. Reports are written with care. Excellent dispersion achieved, minimal loss, data collection complete. The words sound reassuring, almost antiseptic. They cannot capture the unease of using public spaces as an open-air laboratory. Decades later, when the records were declassified, historians and journalists note that thousands of people were exposed, though no one was seriously harmed. Harmless simulant becomes a repeated phrase in official files. Yet the very idea that communities were unknowingly part of an experiment remains unsettling. Residents didn't sign consent forms, and they had no way of opting out. The air itself became a participant in the test. Operation Dew is notable not only for its scale but also for its ingenuity. The military discovered that geography, weather, and urban layout could dramatically affect how a cloud of particles spreads. Experiments repeated under different conditions allowed planners to model potential biological attacks with greater accuracy. Every hill, river, and building became a data point. Every unsuspecting person, unknowingly part of the equation, became a living observer. The files include photographs of fog-laden fields, aerial shots of test clouds drifting over forests, and graphs showing particle concentrations across miles. The military's attention to detail is meticulous, bordering on obsessive. Yet, as with many Cold War-era experiments, the ethical dimension, people breathing invisible clouds without knowledge, was largely unexamined at the time. In retrospect, Operation Dew is a quiet reminder of how experiments can occur outside the laboratory, outside hospitals, and beyond the awareness of those most affected. No dramatic explosions, no fevered subjects in sterile beds, just clouds of invisible particles drifting over an unsuspecting public, recorded with military precision. Next, we'll move from open-air experiments to the controlled chaos of prisons and chemical exposure, with the Holmesburg prison experiments, where human skin became the medium for chemical testing. Philadelphia, 1951. The walls of Holmesburg prison are thick and gray, echoing with the quiet shuffle of inmates' shoes. Behind these walls, a different kind of experiment begins, one that treats human skin as a canvas for chemical research. Welcome to the Holmesburg prison experiments, a program that would last for decades and test hundreds of men with substances most civilians would never touch. The lead scientist, Dr. Albert Kligman, is a dermatologist with an unusual focus. He sees the skin as both an organ and a laboratory. For the U.S. government and private pharmaceutical companies, he sees opportunity. For the inmates, participation means small cash payments or privileges. They are told it's voluntary, but in a system where freedom is already constrained, voluntary carries its own peculiar weight. The substances are varied. Some are pharmaceuticals designed to treat skin conditions, like acne or psoriasis. Others are more sinister: dioxin, radiation creams, experimental antibiotics, and industrial chemicals. Men volunteer, or are persuaded, to have these substances rubbed, scraped, or injected into their skin. They lie in sterile rooms under bright lights while scientists record every rash, every lesion, every irritation. The language of the experiments is clinical: erythema, hyperkeratosis, dermatitis. The notebooks contain neat columns of observations, charts, and graphs. But the words mask the reality: human subjects exposed to chemicals with little long-term oversight, little understanding of potential chronic effects, and no real recourse if harm occurred. Some inmates developed painful rashes. Others experienced burns or scarring. A few reported lasting sensitivity or permanent damage. In Kligman's reports, these are minor side effects, easily manageable and expected in the pursuit of knowledge. The government and pharmaceutical sponsors are mostly satisfied. The data is invaluable. It informs everything from sunscreen formulations to chemical warfare protection. And yet, the ethical questions linger. Were the men fully informed? Could they truly refuse without consequences? Did the financial incentive cloud judgment in an environment where freedom is already limited? By today's standards, the answers are troubling. At the time, the prevailing attitude treated the prison as a convenient population for human experimentation, contained, accessible, and largely invisible to the public. Holmesbug's experiments expanded in scope over the years. Volunteers tested military ointments, industrial compounds, and even psychoactive substances. Some studies involved prolonged exposure to dioxin, a component of Agent Orange, creating lesions and long-term health effects. The files read like a catalog of chemical interaction with human skin, but the human cost is apparent in letters, interviews, and court cases decades later. The inmates, while compensated, were rarely given follow-up care. Some left prison with lingering skin problems or other health issues. The stories of harm were buried under layers of bureaucracy, medical language, and legal protections for the researchers. Yet for scientists, Holmesbug was a goldmine, a controlled population that allowed observation of chemical reactions in real time. For outsiders reading the declassified reports, the contrast is stark. Cold, clinical language describes experiments on humans as if they were test tubes. The environment, bars, fluorescent lights, cement floors, adds an eerie layer to the narrative. Volunteers weren't coerced in the traditional sense, yet the power imbalance, confined space, and financial inducements created a situation that blurred consent in ways still debated today. Holmesbug Prison reminds us that experimentation doesn't always happen in secret labs or distant test sites. Sometimes it occurs where the subjects are already vulnerable, and the results are framed as scientific progress, even when the ethics remain murky. The ocean is vast, cold, and indifferent. During the 1960s, the U.S. military decided it was also a perfect laboratory. Project 112 and its subset SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, involved testing chemical and biological agents on Navy ships and personnel at sea. Unlike laboratories or prisons, the subjects were now moving targets, adrift in a controlled, but inherently unpredictable, environment. The project's stated goal was defensive, to determine how ships, equipment, and sailors would react to potential enemy chemical and biological attacks. The reality was more complex. Thousands of sailors, often unaware of the full details, were exposed to aerosols, simulants, and low-level chemical agents. The seas, wind, and weather became variables in a giant, mobile experiment. The agents used were mostly simulants, chosen to mimic the behavior of real toxins without causing immediate fatalities. Zinc-cadmium sulfide, Bacillus globigii, and other bacteria were sprayed from planes, dropped in canisters, or released near ships. The military carefully tracked dispersal, particle survival, and the effects on ship ventilation systems. Sailors wore protective gear for some tests, while others were told the exercises were routine drills. The idea was simple: collect precise data without creating catastrophe. The ocean's movement, however, introduced chaos. Spray drifted farther than expected, wind patterns shifted. Sailors sometimes inhaled clouds, went about daily duties, and remained unaware of the invisible particles floating around them. Observation posts and instrumentation collected every detail: air samples, particle counts, and environmental data, all feeding into charts that would later guide defense strategy. The human element was unavoidable. Sailors experienced mild irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat during some tests. Some reported rashes or coughing, while most felt nothing at all. The experiments were designed to simulate exposure, not to harm, yet participants were largely uninformed about the nature or risks. Consent existed in theory, but hierarchy and military culture blurred its meaning. Volunteering aboard a ship in the Navy is rarely a fully autonomous decision. The project included hundreds of tests, spanning the Atlantic, Pacific, and Caribbean. Each mission was documented meticulously: latitude, longitude, agent used, concentration, dispersal radius, and recovery procedures. The attention to detail was remarkable, almost obsessive. The government called it research. Decades later, sailors would call it a foggy memory of drills and strange powders. Project 112/SHAD was declassified in the early 2000s. Files revealed that thousands of service members had unknowingly participated. Congressional hearings followed, and some veterans filed claims for health issues they believed linked to the tests. The Department of Defense maintains that most exposures were harmless, but the long-term effects remain difficult to evaluate. What is clear is the scale: ships, aircraft, and personnel moving as a single, floating laboratory, interacting with wind, waves, and unsuspecting seas. The lessons learned were strategic: how to ventilate a ship, how particles settle, how to protect sailors against chemical threats. The moral lesson, though, is harder to quantify. Human beings at sea can become instruments in experiments, even when no malice is intended. The ocean itself seems oblivious to these histories. Waves lap against the hulls of ships, birds circle overhead, and salt spray misting on the deck hides no trace of past tests. Yet archives, spreadsheets, and photographs tell a different story. A sea transformed into a controlled environment, every sailor a moving sensor, every wind gust a variable in a Cold War equation. Project 112/SHAD reminds us that experimentation does not always happen in isolation. Sometimes it rides on the waves, invisible, ephemeral, and drifting into the lives of people who never knew they were part of a study. It's 1950. San Francisco, with its fog-draped hills and bustling streets, seems like any other American city waking to morning routines. Commuters sip coffee, streetcars clatter along the tracks, and children walk to school. But above the city, something invisible is spreading. This is the setting for the San Francisco Navy spraying experiments, a government program designed to study how bacteria travel through the air in urban environments. The Navy's goal is straightforward: release a harmless bacterium over the city and measure how far it disperses. The chosen organism is Serratia marcescens, a microbe that produces a reddish pigment and is generally considered non-pathogenic. Scientists assume it won't cause illness. In theory, the experiment is safe, controlled, and entirely scientific. In practice, it means the unsuspecting public is inhaling a cloud of bacteria without consent. The operation begins on Navy ships just outside the Golden Gate. Canisters filled with the bacterium are released, the contents atomized into tiny droplets. The wind carries the particles inland, over neighborhoods, schools, and parks. Researchers on the ships monitor dispersion patterns, adjusting release points and timing to maximize data collection. The goal is precise measurement. How far do the particles travel? How do temperature, wind, and buildings affect spread? On the streets below, life continues unaware. People breathe the fog, touch surfaces, and go about ordinary routines. Some later develop infections, rare but documented, urinary tract infections, respiratory symptoms, and in a few instances, more serious complications. In official reports, these cases are considered anomalies, unlikely to be related to the experiment. Families affected have no record of consent, no warning, and little recourse. Scientists record every variable. Petri dishes are positioned across the city to capture settling bacteria. Air samples are taken to calculate concentration gradients. Weather stations log wind speed and humidity. Every detail is meticulously documented, forming a dataset that would later inform both defensive and offensive military research. For the Navy, it's a triumph of control and measurement. For the citizens unknowingly participating, it is simply part of daily life, until some notice red pigmented colonies on laboratory dishes, the first hint that something unusual has occurred. The experiment was repeated multiple times, each iteration refining methods and improving accuracy. The military later argued that the organisms were harmless. Historians, looking back, note that the experiment's ethics are questionable at best. People were used as unwitting participants in a scientific test that had no direct benefit to them. The phrase, "for national security," is invoked repeatedly in the files, a justification that masks the lived reality of exposure. The San Francisco experiments are a clear example of Cold War-era risk assessment, the balance between scientific curiosity, national defense, and public safety tipped heavily toward the first two. Residents inhaled bacteria, walked through streets unknowingly part of a laboratory, and returned home to sleep, eat, and live under the assumption that the air was ordinary. When the Navy files were declassified decades later, journalists and scholars were shocked. A city's population had participated in airborne experimentation without awareness. News stories highlighted the tension between military necessity and ethical responsibility. The public reaction ranged from incredulity to outrage. Still, at the time, the Navy had achieved what it wanted: accurate data on bacterial dispersal in urban environments. Looking back, the experiment is quiet, almost mundane in description. Canisters, fog, petri dishes, wind measurements. Yet the implications linger. It is a reminder that the boundaries of scientific research are sometimes porous, especially when framed as preparation for potential wartime threats. San Francisco became both home and test site, streets and neighborhoods part of an invisible laboratory, the population unwittingly participating in a Cold War equation. Alabama, 1932. The South is hot, humid, and slow-moving. Cotton fields stretch for miles, towns are small, and life often feels predetermined. Against this backdrop, the U.S. Public Health Service begins what will become one of the most notorious human experiments in American history, the Tuskegee syphilis study. The subjects are African American men, primarily poor sharecroppers, diagnosed with syphilis, or sometimes simply presumed to have it. They are told they are receiving treatment for bad blood, a vague phrase encompassing fatigue, anemia, and other conditions. In truth, there is no effective treatment offered. Instead, the men are observed, their disease allowed to progress naturally, so that researchers can study its long-term effects. The study is framed as benevolent. Men receive free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. For decades, they are reminded that the government is helping them. They are not told the full story, that penicillin, once discovered in the 1940s, could cure their condition. The treatment exists, but the study continues, untouched by advances in medicine, because observation remains the priority. Over the years, researchers track the progression of syphilis in these men. They document heart damage, neurological decline, and organ failure. They take blood samples, X-rays, and detailed notes, all in the name of science. The subjects are not coerced in the conventional sense. They come to the clinics voluntarily, but consent is fundamentally flawed. It is based on deception. The moral contradictions are stark. For nearly 40 years, men suffer from a preventable disease, their health deteriorating while researchers record symptoms with clinical precision. Families are affected as well. Wives and children unknowingly risk infection. Children are born with congenital syphilis, victims of a study that valued data over human life. Officials justify the experiment using language that sounds technical, detached, almost bureaucratic. Longitudinal study, natural progression, control group. In practice, it is a study where human suffering is expected, calculated, and deemed acceptable for the perceived greater good of medical knowledge. The Tuskegee study continues into the 1970s. By the time a whistleblower exposes it to the press, hundreds of men have died from syphilis or its complications, many unknowingly untreated. The nation reacts with shock, outrage, and disbelief. Congressional hearings follow. The Public Health Service apologizes, calling the study ethically unjustified and morally reprehensible. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologizes on behalf of the United States. The survivors, their families, and descendants bear a legacy of mistrust, trauma, and medical inequality that persists to this day. The study becomes a cautionary tale, the dangers of research conducted without consent, without transparency, and without regard for human dignity. What makes Tuskegee particularly striking is its contrast with other experiments of the same era. Unlike Operation Whitecoat or Project 112, which involved informed volunteers in controlled environments, Tuskegee relied on deception and the social vulnerability of its participants. It is an experiment where culture, race, and socioeconomic status intersected with science, resulting in harm sanctioned by the government itself. The study is preserved in history not just as a series of clinical observations, but as a moral benchmark. Bioethicists, medical historians, and public health officials reference Tuskegee when discussing informed consent, research ethics, and the relationship between marginalized communities and scientific authority. It is a reminder that the cost of knowledge can be measured not only in data points, but in lives irrevocably altered. Looking back, Tuskegee casts a long shadow. The fields of Alabama, once quiet and hot, carry echoes of decades of illness, deception, and bureaucratic rationalization. The lessons remain painfully clear. Science divorced from ethics is not neutral. It is a force capable of sustaining suffering in the name of discovery. The 1950s. The Cold War is heating up, paranoia is high, and the United States intelligence community is convinced that the Soviets and Chinese are developing ways to control minds. Enter MKUltra, a CIA program devoted to understanding and manipulating human consciousness. The goal sounds almost science-fictional. Find methods to extract information, induce compliance, or even erase memory. The methods? Far less fantastical and far more disturbing. The program is vast and secret. Hospitals, universities, and private laboratories are drawn into its orbit. Funding is often covert. Contracts are routed through shell organizations to hide the CIA's involvement. Researchers are told to study mind-altering substances, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation. The experiments target unsuspecting civilians, prisoners, and military personnel alike. Consent is often absent or obtained through vague, misleading explanations. Subjects are given LSD, mescaline, and other psychoactive drugs, sometimes without their knowledge. They are placed in isolation chambers, subjected to extreme sensory deprivation, or subjected to confusing instructions designed to test mental resilience. Some are promised small payments or academic credit. Others are simply caught in a web of secrecy and compliance. The effects are unpredictable. LSD trips can last hours, leaving subjects terrified, confused, or hallucinating. Sleep deprivation breaks down cognition. Sensory experiments produce anxiety, panic, and disorientation. Some subjects never fully recover psychologically. The goal for researchers is data, how the mind responds to extreme conditions, how memory can be disrupted, and whether interrogation techniques can be enhanced. Human experience becomes a laboratory instrument. The files are meticulous. Each reaction is cataloged. Timelines of drug administration, behavior, and physiological response are recorded with military precision. It is clinical, systematic, and detached. Yet behind the ink and graphs lie stories of fear, bewilderment, and trauma. MKUltra is also striking for its scale and audacity. Hundreds of institutions, thousands of subjects, and a budget that stretches into millions of dollars, all hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. Researchers experiment on their own students. Prisons provide easy access to volunteers with limited ability to refuse. Even ordinary citizens, entering clinics for routine tests, can become unwitting participants. The program is so secretive that even CIA directors later describe only fragments of its operations. It is estimated that over 150 subprojects existed, exploring everything from chemical interrogation to psychological conditioning. Yet when documents are destroyed in 1973, much of the record vanishes. What remains are partial reports, testimonies, and anecdotes, a patchwork that hints at the scale and the secrecy. In 1975, the Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigate MKUltra. Hearings reveal shocking details: human experimentation without consent, testing of potent hallucinogens, and systematic deception. Public awareness ignites outrage, but by then, much of the damage is done. The ethical violation is undeniable. The survivors, the unknowing volunteers, and the families of affected individuals are left to cope with the psychological fallout. MKUltra's legacy is complex. Scientifically, some data contributed to understanding of brain chemistry and pharmacology. Culturally, it became emblematic of Cold War secrecy the lengths governments will go in pursuit of advantage, and the moral boundaries that can be crossed in the name of national security. The program also casts a long shadow over research ethics. It contributed directly to the development of stricter informed consent regulations and oversight committees in human subject research. It serves as a cautionary tale. Curiosity and national interest cannot justify experiments that exploit trust or ignore autonomy. In the quiet of the archives, the files are almost haunting. Pages of LSD dosages, graphs of responses, and laboratory notes exist without names, without faces, but not without effect. Human beings were instruments in a clandestine search for control over thought, memory, and perception. Next, we'll turn from psychological manipulation to Project Artichoke, an earlier CIA program exploring similar questions about interrogation, hypnosis, and coercion, laying the foundation for MKUltra itself. The early 1950s. The Cold War is tightening its grip, and the CIA is obsessed with one question: how far can you push a human mind before it breaks? Project Artichoke predates MKUltra but lays much of the groundwork for it. The mission is ambitious, secretive, and morally ambiguous. Explore interrogation, hypnosis, drugs, and coercion in pursuit of information. Artichoke begins in a world filled with fear. The Korean War rages, Soviet intelligence is thought to be everywhere, and American officials are terrified that captured personnel could be brainwashed. In response, the CIA authorizes experiments on human subjects, often without their consent, and sometimes without their knowledge. Volunteers are rare. Many subjects are prisoners or military personnel already under the control of the agency. The experiments are broad. Hypnosis is tested to determine whether it can produce amnesia, compel action, or extract information. Psychoactive drugs, including early doses of LSD, scopolamine, and barbiturates, are administered to see how they alter perception, reduce resistance, or induce compliance. Subjects are observed meticulously. Physiological responses, psychological reactions, and behavioral changes are recorded. The methods are, in many ways, brutal in their subtlety. Some men are placed in isolation chambers for extended periods. Others are subjected to disorienting stimuli, flashing lights, loud noises, or deliberately confusing instructions. Sleep deprivation and stress become tools used to measure how endurance and cognition deteriorate under controlled pressure. Volunteers may be rewarded or threatened, a psychological pendulum designed to test loyalty, memory, and decision-making. The files are clinical, detached, almost antiseptic in tone. Timelines of administration, dosage charts, and behavior logs dominate the records. Yet, beneath the surface, the effects on individuals can be intense: panic, confusion, disorientation, and in some cases long-lasting psychological consequences. In Artichoke, the human mind is a laboratory instrument, carefully measured, manipulated, and observed. One focus of Project Artichoke is what the agency called coercive interrogation. Could drugs or hypnosis induce compliance? Could someone be made to act against their own interests, to reveal secrets or perform tasks without conscious volition? These questions drive experiments that blur the line between science and control. Ethical oversight is minimal, secrecy is absolute. Artichoke also serves as a training ground for later MKUltra projects. Lessons learned here about the effects of psychoactive substances, the limits of hypnotic suggestion, and the psychological consequences of stress inform the next generation of CIA experiments. Methods are refined, documentation improved, and the ethical boundaries stretched even further. By the mid-1950s, Project Artichoke becomes classified to the highest levels. Few outside the agency know it exists. Records are scattered, redacted, and partially destroyed. For decades, the public remains unaware of the experiments conducted on human minds in pursuit of national security. Only in the 1970s, through congressional investigations and whistleblowers, does Artichoke emerge from the shadows, revealing a history of manipulation, secrecy, and ethical compromise. The legacy of Project Artichoke is both scientific and cautionary. On one hand, it contributes to the development of interrogation methods, psychological research, and later pharmacological studies. On the other, it stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of experiments conducted without consent. Men were treated as instruments for knowledge, and the trust inherent in medical and psychological study was repeatedly violated. Artichoke demonstrates the Cold War mindset in its most concentrated form: paranoia, ambition, and a willingness to exploit human vulnerability, all under the banner of national defense. The files, though fragmented, speak volumes about a period when the mind itself became a battlefield, and ordinary humans were the terrain. It's the 1940s, though some experiments stretch into the 1950s. Somewhere in Georgia, military personnel prepare for exercises that are, by design, blistering. The objective: understand the effects of mustard gas on human skin and respiratory systems, and develop protective gear that could save lives, or at least reduce casualties, on a future battlefield. The method is simple: expose volunteers to controlled doses and observe the results. The reality is far more unsettling. The tests take place on open fields, in tents, or inside specialized chambers designed to contain the gas. Soldiers, often in their late teens or early 20s, are assigned to participate. They wear protective clothing in some cases, though sometimes the equipment is deliberately imperfect to simulate battlefield conditions. Canisters of sulfur mustard are released, producing a heavy, oily vapor that clings to skin and fabric. Its odor is faintly sweet, deceptively mild, masking its corrosive power. Observations are meticulous. Medical teams monitor the soldiers for blisters, skin lesions, respiratory irritation, and eye damage. Every reaction is logged in precise detail: onset time, severity, recovery period, and location on the body. Volunteers are sometimes treated immediately; other times, exposure is allowed to continue to measure delayed effects. In the files, the language is clinical, almost detached: dermal erythema, vesication, ocular conjunctivitis. In reality, the subjects are enduring pain, discomfort, and sometimes long-lasting skin damage. The purpose, from the military's perspective, is defensive. By understanding how mustard gas behaves and how humans react, planners can improve protective clothing, decontamination procedures, and medical interventions. Soldiers are effectively test subjects, but the knowledge gained is framed as essential for national security. Ethics are acknowledged in reports, but the emphasis is on controlled conditions rather than consent. One soldier later recalls the experience as surreal: lined up in fields, breathing the oily vapor, feeling the first stinging sensations on his face and hands. Medical observers remain calm, recording everything with clipboards and stopwatches. The dissonance between clinical observation and human discomfort is stark, and perhaps intentional. Pain is data, after all. The tests also include long-term follow-ups. Researchers document how skin heals, whether scarring occurs, and the potential for chronic respiratory effects. Soldiers may report itching, sensitivity to sunlight, or lingering eye irritation months after exposure. The data collected forms the basis for future chemical warfare defense protocols, shaping U.S. military preparedness for decades. Notably, these experiments are largely hidden from the public at the time. Only participants and select military personnel are aware. Files were classified, detailing each dose, each reaction, and each procedural adjustment. Mustard gas, a legacy of World War I, finds new relevance in Cold War strategy, but its human cost is largely invisible outside military records. When historians later examine the Georgia state mustard gas tests, they note a pattern repeated across many military experiments: volunteers subjected to chemical or biological agents, detailed observation and documentation, and a persistent focus on data over individual experience. Soldiers were considered rational participants in a national experiment, yet the unpredictability of exposure and the severity of reactions challenge the assumption of truly informed consent. The Georgia tests leave a quiet imprint in history: meticulous spreadsheets, clinical language, and photographs of volunteers in protective gear. Behind the numbers, however, are human experiences of pain, endurance, and uncertainty. It is a reminder that military science often operates on the edge of ethics, balancing knowledge and national interest against the lived realities of its subjects. It's the 1960s. The Cold War has shifted into a psychological dimension. Nuclear bombs are terrifying, but mind control and chemical incapacitation have their own strategic allure. At Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, the U.S. Army returns to chemical experimentation, this time combining the bizarre with the dangerous. Welcome to the LSD tests, where soldiers become participants in experiments meant to explore both mental and physical vulnerability. Volunteers are primarily enlisted men, told they are participating in behavioral research or chemical safety testing. Some are curious, some obedient, some simply following orders. The compounds are prepared in precise doses, LSD, combined in some cases with other chemicals like stimulants or sedatives. The goal is multifaceted: determine psychological effects, test potential incapacitation, and record physiological reactions. The setting is controlled. Soldiers are placed in sterile rooms, sometimes furnished to look ordinary, sometimes deliberately clinical. Lights are adjusted, minimal stimuli are provided, and observers sit nearby with clipboards and instruments. Every heartbeat, pupil dilation, and verbal reaction is recorded. Sometimes volunteers are asked to perform tasks, navigate mazes, follow instructions, or interact socially. The idea is to measure cognitive disruption under chemical influence. The effects are dramatic, unpredictable, and sometimes frightening. LSD can induce intense hallucinations, disorientation, paranoia, and euphoria in equal measure. Soldiers report seeing patterns on the walls, experiencing distorted time, or feeling as if they are floating. Some panic. Others become lethargic, unresponsive, or overly talkative. Observers document each reaction meticulously. The human mind, in altered states, becomes a laboratory instrument. Physical reactions accompany the psychological: elevated heart rates, sweating, nausea, tremors, and in rare cases, fainting. The experiment is designed to assess both mind and body under chemical stress. Safety measures exist, but they are imperfect. Medical personnel remain on standby, but the inherent risk is understood, recorded, and, in a sense, normalized. The soldier's consent is a recurring question. Officially, participation is voluntary. In practice, the hierarchy of the military complicates true choice. Some volunteers feel pressure to comply or fear negative consequences for refusal. Compensation and recognition are provided, yet the power dynamics of the armed forces cast a long shadow over any notion of free agreement. Edgewood Arsenal's LSD tests are part of a broader pattern in military chemical research, studying incapacitating agents for defensive purposes while generating data on human tolerance and reaction. Every hallucination, every lapse in judgment, every physiological response is cataloged, analyzed, and used to refine chemical safety protocols and potential combat applications. What makes these experiments particularly striking is their intersection of physical and psychological research. Unlike mustard gas tests or insect dispersals, LSD directly manipulates perception and cognition. Soldiers' minds become data points. Their fears, confusion, and hallucinations are measured, classified, and sometimes replicated in subsequent trials. The experiments blend chemistry, neurology, and psychology in a uniquely invasive way. The results remain largely classified for decades. Only later does the public learn the scope of the LSD experiments at Edgewood, revealing a mixture of clinical interest, strategic calculation, and ethical ambiguity. Some volunteers report lasting effects: heightened anxiety, flashbacks, or ongoing distrust of authority. Others dismiss it as an unusual, if intense, experience. The data collected, however, informs chemical agent protocols, safety thresholds, and behavioral research that extends well into later decades. Edgewood Arsenal LSD tests remind us that military experimentation is not always about explosions or battlefield casualties. Sometimes it's about the mind itself, its malleability, vulnerability, and the surprising ways chemicals can reveal, distort, or dismantle ordinary cognition. Soldiers were instruments, sometimes willing, sometimes coerced, often unaware of the full scope of their participation. It's the 1950s and 1960s, and the Cold War has brought biological threats into focus. Anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, is no longer just a pathogen of livestock. It's a weapon in the eyes of military planners. The Army sets out to test vaccines on its soldiers, turning human volunteers into moving laboratories, sometimes with consequences that extend beyond the data sheets. The experiments are conducted at military installations, including Fort Detrick, Maryland. Soldiers are recruited, often under the guise of standard inoculation procedures, or with promises of medical benefits, compensation, and career advancement. They are told the purpose is protective, to safeguard troops against a potential biological attack. In practice, they are also part of controlled studies measuring efficacy, dosage tolerability, and immune response over time. The vaccine is administered via injection, sometimes multiple doses over months. Observers record physical reactions, fever, swelling at the injection site, malaise, and, in some cases, allergic responses. Blood samples are drawn periodically to measure antibody production. The goal is rigorous: determine the minimum effective dose, the timing for boosters, and the overall safety profile. Soldiers' bodies become living datasets, moving through schedules of observation, inoculation, and recovery. Side effects are frequent and sometimes severe. Some soldiers report significant pain, high fever, and fatigue. Others develop rashes or experience temporary incapacitation. Official reports often downplay these reactions, noting that most are mild or expected. Yet personal accounts tell another story: soldiers struggling with repeated injections, frustration at uncertainty about long-term health, and a subtle unease at being part of an experiment where risk is normalized. The experiments also reveal the tension between public health and military necessity. Anthrax is a deadly threat, and vaccine efficacy could mean the difference between survival and disaster in a potential battlefield scenario. Yet the human cost, discomfort, risk, and psychological stress is borne largely by the volunteers, whose participation is framed as patriotic duty rather than full informed consent. The Army conducts variations on these tests over time. Some studies involve combining the anthrax vaccine with other vaccines, or testing its effectiveness under conditions of stress and fatigue. Others explore shelf life stability and immune response in extreme environmental conditions. Each iteration produces more data, improving military preparedness while quietly amplifying the ethical ambiguity. By the 1970s, awareness of the experiments grows. Congressional hearings, investigative journalism, and veterans' accounts reveal that thousands of troops were vaccinated, often without full disclosure of the risks. Health consequences are difficult to track, in part because the effects can be delayed or subtle. For many, the vaccines protect successfully, but the record also highlights the tension inherent in using living humans to study agents of war. From a historical perspective, the Army anthrax vaccine experiments occupy a space between clinical science and military necessity. They are meticulously documented, scientifically rigorous, and designed with clear operational goals. Yet they also exemplify the era's willingness to prioritize national security over individual autonomy. Soldiers volunteered, yes, but the chain of command, the promises of duty, and the framing of risk make the voluntariness complicated. The experiments also inform later vaccine programs, biodefense planning, and policy on human subject research. Ethical standards evolve in part because of scrutiny of such programs, emphasizing informed consent, disclosure of risk, and long-term follow-up for subjects. The lessons, though, are etched in the experiences of those who participated, willingly or not. In the quiet of military archives, anthrax vials, injection records, and immune response charts sit alongside logs of fever, pain, and fatigue. The science is clear, the data is valuable, but the human experience, the subtle fear, the discomfort, the uncertainty remains largely invisible. These experiments are a reminder that the pursuit of preparedness can sometimes transform ordinary soldiers into instruments of observation, enduring risk so that others might be safer. It's the 1960s. The Cold War has stretched across oceans, and U.S. military planners are thinking globally. One remote island in the Pacific becomes a testing ground, Okinawa. Here, soldiers, local environments, and the unpredictable forces of nature are enlisted into a series of Project 112 biological warfare tests, part of a broader program evaluating the effects of chemical and biological agents outside the continental United States. The objectives are simple in theory: assess dispersion, survivability, and containment of biological agents in a real-world, tropical environment. The agents are mostly simulants, such as Bacillus globigii, meant to mimic deadly pathogens without causing widespread illness. Still, the experiments carry risk, both known and unknown. Winds shift, rainfall dilutes, and humidity transforms particle behavior. The environment becomes a variable as complex and unpredictable as human subjects themselves. U.S. troops are deployed to controlled zones to participate in the tests. Protective gear is issued, but not always foolproof. Some exposures are incidental, part of routine exercises, while others are deliberate, designed to see how long the agents remain viable under environmental stress. Soldiers' movements, breathing, and interaction with surfaces are monitored to track potential exposure pathways. Every step, every touch, every breath is quietly documented. The military also monitors flora and fauna. Insects, birds, and small mammals are part of the equation. How do they carry particles? How far can spores travel on air currents? The island's ecosystem itself becomes an experimental apparatus, a living grid to map dispersal. Data sheets include wind measurements, humidity logs, and surprisingly detailed behavioral notes on wildlife. Even the clouds participate, carrying invisible payloads across the terrain. From the perspective of the local population, these tests are mostly invisible. Villages and communities go about daily life, unaware that microorganisms drift through air, soil, and water. Exposure to simulants is considered low risk, yet the presence of foreign pathogens, combined with a lack of informed consent, creates an ethical gray zone. Residents, like the soldiers, are essentially unwitting participants in a large-scale, government-sanctioned experiment. Observers note both intended and unintended outcomes. Some agents persist longer than predicted, traveling farther than planned. Equipment designed to measure deposition sometimes fails, leaving gaps in data. Soldiers report minor irritation or rashes, while animals occasionally show unexpected reactions. Every anomaly is carefully catalogued, the files read like a meticulous chronicle of a world in miniature, where nature and science intersect unpredictably. Project 112 in Okinawa is emblematic of Cold War experimentation, global in scope, secretive in execution, and precise in documentation. For planners, it is invaluable, real-world testing in an environment unlike the continental U.S., providing insights into dispersal, persistence, and potential countermeasures. For participants and local residents, it is a silent, largely invisible intrusion into daily life, with consequences that were never fully communicated. The legacy of Okinawa's tests is complex. The experiments contribute to U.S. biodefense knowledge, shaping protocols for chemical and biological agent preparedness. Yet decades later, declassified documents reveal the ethical ambiguities: human subjects exposed without full consent, ecosystems unknowingly enlisted, and a community unaware of its participation. The data exists, clear and precise, but the human dimension is quieter, subtler, and sometimes overlooked entirely. In retrospect, the Okinawa tests illustrate a recurring Cold War pattern: the intersection of environment, human subjects, and military necessity. Soldiers, civilians, and even wildlife become instruments for understanding invisible threats, often without full knowledge or agency. Wind and rain, like bureaucracy and secrecy, carry particles across landscapes, and along with them, the quiet weight of experimentation. It's the late 1950s. Most Cold War biological experiments are shrouded in secrecy, but at Operation Whitecoat, the U.S. Army finds something unusual: volunteers. These aren't prisoners or unknowing civilians. They are conscientious objectors, members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who agree to participate in experiments as a matter of duty, curiosity, or personal conviction. The distinction is subtle but meaningful. For once, informed consent exists. White Coat takes place at Fort Detrick, Maryland, a hub for biological warfare research. Volunteers are exposed to infectious agents such as Q fever, tularemia, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus. The objective is clear: study disease progression, develop vaccines, and improve treatment protocols for soldiers and civilians. Unlike many Cold War programs, participants are fully briefed, monitored closely, and given the option to withdraw, though few do, partly out of a sense of duty. The experiments are methodical. Volunteers are isolated in controlled environments, dosed with the pathogen under careful supervision, and monitored around the clock. Nurses and medical officers record every symptom: fever, fatigue, rash, respiratory changes, neurological effects. Blood samples, cultures, and clinical observations provide detailed data. For scientists, it's an extraordinary opportunity to study diseases in real time. For participants, it is a calculated risk undertaken with awareness. Despite consent, the experiments are not without discomfort or danger. Subjects experience high fevers, headaches, nausea, and in some cases, severe symptoms requiring immediate treatment. The Army ensures that medical intervention is available, including antibiotics and supportive care. Still, the psychological strain of knowingly contracting an infectious disease cannot be ignored. Volunteers endure isolation, repeated sampling, and the uncertainty of the infection's course. Their experience is documented meticulously, every heartbeat and symptom serving the broader purpose of national preparedness. White Coat is striking for its contrast with contemporaneous programs like MKUltra or the Tuskegee study. Here, autonomy and ethical oversight exist, yet the underlying goal remains military readiness. Volunteers are part of a calculated experiment with tangible risks. Unlike in earlier experiments where deception, coercion, or ignorance dominated, White Coat participants consciously trade personal safety for knowledge and protection of others. The moral dimension shifts subtly but meaningfully. The data collected is invaluable. Vaccines are developed and refined, treatment protocols are tested, and the Army gains insight into the effectiveness of containment procedures. The program runs from 1954 to 1973, involving hundreds of volunteers. Every outcome, successes, complications, anomalies, is recorded in painstaking detail. The meticulous records reflect both scientific rigor and ethical awareness, creating a rare example of responsible human experimentation during a period otherwise defined by secrecy and exploitation. White Coat volunteers often describe the experience with a mix of pride and bemusement. They were exposed to dangerous pathogens, lived through fevered days and sleepless nights, and yet their participation was framed as service rather than sacrifice. The researchers' clinical detachment contrasts with the human resilience on display, men willingly becoming part of a biological experiment in pursuit of knowledge and protection. From a historical perspective, Operation White Coat is fascinating because it demonstrates that ethical human experimentation is possible even within a military and defense context. Participants are informed, procedures are monitored, and risks are mitigated. Yet the shadow of Cold War urgency still hangs over the project. The purpose remains defense, the environment remains experimental, and the military benefits from knowledge gained at human cost, even if that cost is consciously accepted. White Coat stands as a rare example of cooperation between human volunteers and military research. It is meticulous, scientifically productive, and ethically conscious, a quiet counterpoint to the clandestine, coercive experiments that dominated the same era. And in the calm halls of Fort Detrick, amid charts, incubators, and fevered subjects, history quietly remembers the men who volunteered to face disease for the sake of knowledge and national security. The desert is quiet. White sand stretches across the Nevada test site, and the sun glares down on soldiers standing in formation. It's the 1950s, the height of the nuclear arms race, and the U.S. military wants to know how humans fare under the unimaginable conditions of atomic warfare. Welcome to the Atomic Veterans Experiments, where soldiers became living instruments in the study of radiation, fallout, and survivability. The soldiers, often in their late teens or early 20s, are briefed, or partially briefed, on their roles. They are positioned at varying distances from nuclear detonations, some hundreds of meters away, some farther, to simulate battlefield conditions. Protective gear varies from minimal to moderate. Some wear steel helmets and goggles. Others, curious to history, later report feeling as if they were dressed for a photo rather than protection. When the bombs detonate, the effects are immediate and visible. A blinding flash, a towering mushroom cloud, and a wave of heat sweep across the test site. Soldiers are instructed to observe, measure, and report. Instruments record radiation levels, air quality, and thermal effects. Soldiers themselves are data points, their proximity, exposure time, and reactions meticulously logged. The experiments are designed to answer practical questions. How far does radiation travel? How do blast waves impact human movement and behavior? Can protective clothing and tactics improve survival rates? The goal is straightforward, but the human cost is unpredictable. Radiation burns, nausea, temporary blindness, and disorientation are common. Long-term exposure risks, cancer, organ damage, or genetic effects are largely unknown at the time. Unlike chemical tests, these experiments are public in one sense. Military observers, journalists, and photographers are sometimes present. Yet the true scale of exposure and the long-term consequences remain hidden for decades. Soldiers carry the results in their bodies, their medical records, and sometimes in their descendants' DNA. For the military, the data is invaluable. They learn how soldiers function in extreme conditions, how equipment performs under thermal and radiological stress, and how training might mitigate injury. They also observe human reactions, fear, confusion, adrenaline surges, and the occasional instinctive error. Every detail is logged, every movement charted, producing a human-scale map of survivability under nuclear assault. The soldiers themselves are often proud, curious, or compliant, yet unaware of the full spectrum of risk. Few fully grasp the potential for long-term radiation exposure. The culture of the military, combined with Cold War urgency, frames participation as duty. The ethics are murky by modern standards, but at the time, patriotism and obedience blur the lines between voluntary service and unwitting experimentation. Over the years, thousands of men participate in multiple tests. Some are exposed repeatedly, in rotations designed to study cumulative effects. Protective measures are refined, observation techniques improved, and medical monitoring evolves. Yet the long-term data on health effects remains incomplete, partially due to secrecy, partially because radiation illnesses can take years to manifest. Veterans often report unusual cancers, thyroid issues, and other conditions later linked to exposure. The atomic veterans experiments illustrate a recurring Cold War theme: human bodies used as instruments to measure risk, improve military strategy, and prepare for potential global catastrophe. The desert is silent, the mushroom clouds dissipate, but the imprint on participants is lasting, physical, psychological, and generational. Historians, looking back, note the paradox. These soldiers are both celebrated for bravery and simultaneously subjected to hazards that were not fully disclosed. The experiments produced unparalleled knowledge on survivability, but at the cost of human certainty, health, and consent. The desert sands, scorched and quiet, hold the echoes of a time when science, strategy, and human vulnerability intersected explosively. It's the early 1950s. The Cold War is intensifying, and the U.S. government wants to understand a terrifying new reality: radioactive fallout in urban environments. Soldiers and volunteers are useful, yes, but what about ordinary civilians? Thus begins the Atomic City experiments, a series of secret tests where everyday Americans, unaware, become unwitting participants in the study of nuclear exposure. The experiments take place in multiple cities, often through subtle means. Radioactive particles, sometimes derived from harmless isotopes like zinc or later strontium, are dispersed in the air, water, or building materials. The goal is simple: track how radiation moves through urban landscapes, how it settles on surfaces, and how it enters human bodies. Schools, offices, and neighborhoods become experimental zones. Citizens breathe, touch, and live their daily lives under an invisible cloud. Unlike the military tests, there is no protective gear, no informed consent, no sense of participation. Life continues normally. Children play outside, commuters ride buses, clerks file paperwork. Yet above them, scientists measure deposition rates, monitor airflow, and collect environmental samples. Data points are humans, buildings, and objects alike. Everything is part of the laboratory. The methodology is meticulous. Air sampling devices, dust collectors, and smear tests are placed strategically. Radioactive tracers are released in controlled quantities, enough to measure dispersal but supposedly too little to cause immediate harm. Scientists track how the particles interact with wind, temperature, and humidity. Urban obstacles, buildings, streets, vehicles, are treated as variables in a living, breathing experiment. Results are fascinating for planners. Data reveals how radiation clings to surfaces, infiltrates ventilation systems, and enters food and water sources. It informs evacuation planning, fallout shelter design, and civil defense protocols. The human experience, however, is incidental. The residents are unknowingly participating in a massive environmental study without their knowledge or consent. Some later studies revealed subtle health effects. While the doses were generally low, the long-term risks of radiation exposure, cancer, organ damage, genetic effects, were poorly understood at the time. Citizens were treated as passive instruments, breathing in particles, touching surfaces, and unknowingly contributing to a scientific model of urban fallout behavior. Files later declassified show careful measurements, calculations, and charts, but almost nothing about the human dimension beyond assumptions that exposure was minimal. The ethics are stark. Unlike Operation Whitecoat, there is no informed consent, no voluntary participation, and no explicit acknowledgement of risk. The experiments illustrate a recurring Cold War mindset. National security and scientific curiosity outweigh personal autonomy. Ordinary Americans became unwitting subjects in a vast laboratory where radiation was the independent variable and everyday life the dependent one. The imagery is haunting. Children walking to school, unaware that isotopes are settling on the playground. Commuters breathing particles as they cross streets. Office workers opening windows as invisible tracers drift inside. The urban landscape becomes a controlled environment, a city-sized petri dish, and the population largely oblivious to their participation. Historians note that the atomic city experiments, though less immediately dramatic than mushroom clouds or blistering chemicals, represent a significant expansion of human experimentation, the shift from controlled volunteers or soldiers to entire civilian populations. Risk is distributed broadly and invisibly, consent is absent, and the scale is unprecedented. The legacy is subtle yet profound. Data informs civil defense and fallout preparedness. Declassified records decades later reveal the experiment's scale, scope, and secrecy, prompting public outrage and raising long-lasting ethical questions. Citizens unknowingly breathed in, touched, and lived alongside the very experiments meant to protect them, or at least prepare for potential threats. In the quiet hum of urban life, the atomic city experiments linger as a shadow of Cold War pragmatism. The city itself becomes a laboratory, and everyday humans are unwitting participants, their normal routines transformed into data points in a grand, radioactive experiment. It's the 1960s, and medicine has embraced the promise of radiation. Hospitals across the country experiment with X-rays, radioactive tracers, and isotopes, seeking insight into human biology, cancer detection, and organ function. In San Antonio, Texas, patients in hospitals and clinics unknowingly become subjects in a series of radiation experiments, where science, secrecy, and ethics collide. The participants are ordinary people, seeking medical care for ailments ranging from minor injuries to serious illnesses. They arrive expecting treatment, not experimentation. Some are children, some are adults, some elderly. None fully understand that their bodies are being used as instruments in research designed to chart the effects of radiation exposure. Consent forms exist in theory, but the reality is murkier. Explanations are vague, omissions are common, and the full risks are rarely disclosed. The methodology varies. Patients are exposed to X-rays targeted at specific organs, sometimes at doses higher than would be typical for diagnostic purposes. Radioactive isotopes may be administered orally or intravenously, then tracked through blood, urine, and tissues. The aim is to understand absorption, organ retention, and metabolic pathways. Observers record measurements meticulously, noting timing, dosage, and biological response. Every heartbeat, excretion, and scan is data. Some patients experience mild side effects, nausea, fatigue, skin irritation, or minor burns. Others suffer more severe consequences over time, including organ damage or increased cancer risk. For the researchers, these outcomes are calculated, expected, and recorded. For the patients, they are often unexpected, frightening, and medically confusing. The hospital, normally a place of healing, doubles as a laboratory. Physicians and scientists justify the experiments in clinical and patriotic terms. Better understanding of radiation could improve diagnostics, save future patients, and advance scientific knowledge. Yet the human element, the fear, uncertainty, and potential harm, is largely secondary. The line between medical care and experimentation is deliberately blurred, leaving patients unaware of the risks they assume unknowingly. Records from the experiments reveal meticulous attention to detail. Dosage logs, radiation maps, patient charts, and time-stamped results dominate the archives. Scientists monitor organ-specific uptake, radiation decay, and systemic distribution. Every physiological response is cataloged, every anomaly noted. In a technical sense, the experiments are rigorous, producing valuable data on human physiology and radioactive exposure. Yet the ethical questions linger. Patients were not informed of the full risks, nor were they offered genuine choice. Many would have refused participation if fully aware. The experiments underscore a persistent Cold War pattern. The pursuit of knowledge often eclipsed individual autonomy, and the promise of medical advancement was leveraged to justify exposure to risk. Some patients later report lasting effects, cancers, organ dysfunction, or general health decline, which they suspect is linked to the experiments. Public awareness grows decades later, following declassification and investigative reporting. Lawsuits and compensation programs are initiated, but the psychological and physical impact cannot be fully undone. The patients, the unwitting participants, remain a living testament to the hidden human cost of medical research conducted under secrecy. The San Antonio radiation experiments are notable not for spectacle, but for subtlety. Unlike mushroom clouds or mustard gas, the exposure is quiet, clinical, and dispersed over time. Yet its impact is profound. Ordinary people, seeking care, unknowingly become instruments for scientific observation, their daily lives intertwined with experiments they did not agree to. Historians and ethicists cite these experiments when discussing informed consent, patient rights, and the limits of human subject research. The lessons are stark. Data and discovery must never come at the expense of autonomy, transparency, or the trust inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. In retrospect, the San Antonio radiation experiments leave a quiet but indelible mark. Hospitals, clinics, and laboratories, places of healing, were also theaters of experimentation. Patients were silent participants, their bodies mapped, measured, and monitored without full knowledge. The experiments stand as a reminder that even in peacetime, science can wield extraordinary power over the lives of ordinary people. It's the 1940s and 1950s, the dawn of the nuclear age. Scientists are obsessed with one question: what happens when the human body absorbs plutonium, one of the deadliest substances known? Hospitals and laboratories become the stage for the plutonium injection experiments, where patients and military volunteers are deliberately exposed to radioactive isotopes, often without full understanding of the risks. The participants are often vulnerable: terminally ill patients, unsuspecting hospital patients, or members of the military considered expendable by modern ethical standards. Injections are administered intravenously, the radioactive material measured with precision to track its movement through the bloodstream, deposition in organs, and excretion patterns. The goal is purely scientific: understand retention rates, organ targeting, and biological effects of plutonium. The experiments are meticulous. Scientists draw blood at regular intervals, perform biopsies, and use early forms of radiography to monitor organ deposition. Every microgram is logged, every decay recorded. The data is precise, invaluable to the Manhattan Project and the broader nuclear weapons program. The human cost, however, is profound and often invisible. Participants rarely know the full danger. Some patients experience mild reactions, nausea, weakness, or local irritation at the injection site. Others face long-term risks that would only manifest years later: cancer, organ failure, or cumulative radiation poisoning. In the laboratory notes, these outcomes are expected variables or baseline data, but in reality, they are human lives slowly altered by exposure to one of the most toxic elements known to science. The ethical framework, or lack thereof, is stark. Consent is minimal or misleading. Patients are sometimes told the injections are for treatment, diagnostic purposes, or benign research. Military volunteers are informed vaguely, but hierarchy and duty create pressure that blurs genuine consent. The Cold War's urgency, combined with the awe of nuclear science, justifies experimentation that would be unthinkable today. In these experiments, science and secrecy intertwine. Results inform safety protocols for nuclear workers, medical understanding of radioactive exposure, and long-term studies of radiation toxicity. Yet they do so at the expense of human autonomy. Data sheets, lab notebooks, and graphs capture the movement of plutonium with mathematical elegance, while the lived experience of the participants, fear, confusion, illness, is largely absent. The experiments are repeated across hospitals and laboratories in the U.S., often without public awareness. Decades later, declassified documents reveal the scope. Dozens of individuals injected, tracked, and monitored, their bodies a means to an end in the pursuit of nuclear knowledge. Some survived with minimal effects, others suffered complications, and a few paid the ultimate price decades later. Historians view the plutonium injection experiments as emblematic of mid-20th century ethical blind spots. They demonstrate the willingness of institutions to prioritize national security and scientific discovery over informed consent. They also reveal the human cost of pioneering research in a time when radioactive elements were as mysterious as they were feared. The imagery lingers: sterile hospital rooms, vials of radioactive plutonium, scientists recording meticulous measurements, and patients unaware of the invisible threat coursing through their veins. The clinical precision contrasts starkly with the profound moral ambiguity. The experiments leave an indelible mark, not only in scientific understanding but in the evolution of research ethics, influencing policies and oversight that would eventually protect future participants. In retrospect, the plutonium injection experiments are haunting. They represent the extreme intersection of science, secrecy, and human vulnerability, an era when the pursuit of knowledge literally injected danger into living bodies. The participants' experiences, largely hidden for decades, remind us of the silent, often invisible consequences of experimentation conducted in the shadows of the atomic age. It's the 1950s. The Cold War is in full swing, and the U.S. military is obsessed with the possibility of biological attacks on American cities. How would spores or chemical agents disperse in the urban environment? How far would they travel? And how could defense systems be designed to respond? Enter Operation LAC, a covert program where civilians and the environment become unwitting participants in an enormous airborne experiment. LAC stands for Large Area Coverage, a deliberately understated name for a program of grand scope. Trucks and aircraft disperse zinc-cadmium sulfide (ZnCdS) particles over hundreds of miles across multiple states. These particles are chemically inert and fluorescent, safe, according to contemporary understanding, but at the time, the long-term effects of repeated exposure were poorly studied. Residents have no idea that their daily routines, walking to school, commuting, shopping, are part of a military experiment. The methodology is precise. Planes fly predetermined routes, releasing particles at specific altitudes. Trucks spray them along highways. Ground monitors track deposition, wind patterns, and distance traveled. Sensors on rooftops, in fields, and along streets collect samples. The goal is clear: measure dispersal, understand how particles move with wind, temperature, and urban obstacles, and model how biological or chemical agents might behave in a real attack. Soldiers, engineers, and scientists run the operation, logging every particle count, every square mile covered. Data sheets resemble meteorological reports, tracking invisible clouds across geography. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans go about their lives, oblivious to the tiny fluorescent dust drifting through air ducts, settling on lawns, or coating cars. Operation LAC reveals some unexpected results. Particles travel farther than anticipated, sometimes hundreds of miles from release points. Settling is influenced by weather, geography, and even human activity. Researchers gain invaluable insight into the behavior of aerosolized materials. The civilian population, however, remains uninformed, effectively turning towns and cities into passive participants in a large-scale, uncontrolled experiment. The ethical implications are striking. Unlike Operation Whitecoat, participants are not volunteers. Unlike the Atomic City experiments, the scale is enormous, spanning multiple states and affecting hundreds of thousands of residents. Risk is assumed by the population without their knowledge or consent, justified by a military calculus. Knowledge gained now could save lives later. Some later studies question the potential health impacts of zinc-cadmium sulfide. While officially considered safe at the doses used, the long-term effects of repeated exposure, combined with other environmental toxins, remain debated. Families, workers, and children unknowingly inhaled or ingested particles, contributing to a dataset where human bodies were the measured variable, not the beneficiaries. Operation LAC exemplifies Cold War thinking. The nation itself as a laboratory, human beings treated as passive sensors in a massive experiment. The objective is pragmatic: understand dispersal to improve civil defense planning, protective measures, and response protocols. Yet the method, covertly exposing citizens to particles, tracking environmental behavior, remains ethically ambiguous, a recurring pattern in mid-20th century experimentation. The imagery is subtle but haunting. Airplanes streaking across the sky, trucks leaving invisible trails along highways, fluorescent dust settling on rooftops, schoolyards, and streets. Ordinary Americans unknowingly inhale, touch, and interact with the material. Meanwhile, military observers chart numbers, patterns, and distances, detached from the human consequences of their dataset. Decades later, declassified documents reveal the program's scale and secrecy. The military intended no harm, yet the operation raises questions about consent, transparency, and the use of populations as instruments for knowledge. Operation LAC, like many Cold War experiments, highlights the tension between national security and individual autonomy, between scientific curiosity and human rights. In retrospect, the program leaves a quiet but indelible mark, a reminder that the Cold War transformed ordinary life into an experimental grid, where knowledge, risk, and secrecy intertwined invisibly. Citizens were part of an airborne experiment, unwittingly participating in data collection that spanned states and crossed the skies, long before modern ethics would demand consent and disclosure. It's 1954, the Pacific is calm, and the U.S. military is conducting Operation Castle, a series of thermonuclear tests on Bikini and Enuitak atolls. The most infamous detonation, Castle Bravo, produces a yield far larger than expected, spreading radioactive fallout across inhabited islands. Suddenly, ordinary residents, men, women, and children, become part of an unplanned experiment, Project 4.1, designed to study the effects of radiation on humans. The targets are both accidental and intentional. Islanders are exposed to fallout they cannot see or smell. Soldiers monitoring the tests are likewise exposed, sometimes at relatively close range. Fallout spreads over hundreds of miles, carried by wind and rain. Crops, water sources, and soil become contaminated, and the local population is subjected to radiation without prior warning or consent. Project 4.1 is, in essence, a natural experiment amplified by human negligence. Scientists arrive after the detonation to document symptoms, collect biological samples, and observe the effects of acute and chronic radiation exposure. Blood is drawn, urine analyzed, skin lesions photographed. Symptoms are catalogued: nausea, vomiting, hair loss, burns, diarrhea, and in some cases, severe internal organ damage. The methodology is clinical but morally complicated. Researchers often justify their presence as necessary to understand the effects of fallout and to protect future populations. Yet the subjects did not volunteer. They did not understand the risk. They were, in many ways, unknowing participants in one of the first large-scale radiation exposure studies in human history. Medical teams follow residents over weeks, months, and years, documenting delayed consequences: thyroid disease, cataracts, leukemia, and other cancers. Children, who are more sensitive to radiation, suffer disproportionately. The long-term monitoring creates an archive of human vulnerability, a dataset extracted from unintended exposure rather than voluntary experimentation. Soldiers exposed during observation are treated similarly, though with slightly better documentation of doses and proximity. Yet the human impact remains profound. Veterans report radiation sickness symptoms long after the detonation, while islanders grapple with contamination of their homes, food supply, and environment. The experiment merges natural disaster with human oversight, blurring lines between accident, science, and ethical responsibility. Project 4.1 stands out because it bridges environmental, military, and medical experimentation. Fallout acts as the independent variable, humans as both dependent variable and instrument, and the environment as medium and modifier. Data is collected systematically: symptoms, blood counts, radiation measurements, and growth abnormalities. For the scientists, the experiment is invaluable. For the subjects, it is frightening, disorienting, and often life-altering. Ethically, the project is deeply problematic. Residents were not warned or evacuated, and full disclosure of health risks was delayed for decades. Compensation, when offered, is often minimal and insufficient to address long-term health consequences or cultural disruption. The experiment exemplifies a Cold War mindset that prioritized national defense and scientific knowledge over human autonomy, particularly when the participants were distant, foreign, or othered in official perception. The visual and psychological imagery is striking. Islanders, accustomed to daily fishing and farming, find their land, water, and food poisoned invisibly. Soldiers, trained to observe and document, witness the human consequences in real time. Meanwhile, scientists measure, chart, and record with clinical detachment. The cloud of fallout lingers as both literal and metaphorical, marking the intersection of technology, power, and vulnerability. Decades later, declassified documents and survivor testimonies reveal the scale and impact of Project 4.1. The data significantly advanced understanding of radiation exposure, informing safety standards, evacuation protocols, and medical treatments. Yet the ethical cost, unwitting human subjects, disrupted communities, and long-term health consequences, remains a haunting aspect of Cold War experimentation. In retrospect, Project 4.1 underscores a central tension of the era: knowledge versus consent, science versus autonomy, and national security versus human dignity. Islanders and soldiers alike became instruments in a massive experiment, their suffering catalogued as data, their lives altered by fallout they did not choose to inhale, ingest, or endure. The 1960s and 1970s. The Cold War is still in full swing, but now radiation research moves indoors. Hospitals, government laboratories, and military facilities across the U.S. become sites for what are collectively known as the human radiation experiments. Unlike nuclear tests in deserts or oceans, these experiments bring radioactive exposure into hospitals, clinics, and controlled domestic environments, often without the knowledge or consent of the subjects. The participants are varied. Hospital patients seeking treatment, vulnerable individuals in long-term care, pregnant women, infants, and prisoners all find themselves unwittingly included in experiments. Some receive radioactive isotopes, plutonium, uranium, iodine, or strontium, through injection, ingestion, or inhalation. Others are exposed to X-rays or radioactive tracers under the guise of diagnostic procedures. Consent is often vague, misleading, or entirely absent. Patients are unaware that their bodies are the subject of research as much as their illnesses are. The experiments have multiple objectives. Some aim to track how radioactive isotopes travel through the body, which organs retain the highest concentrations, and how excretion occurs. Others explore the effects of radiation on fetal development, immune response, or disease progression. The goal is pragmatic: better understand radiation for medical treatment, occupational safety, and national defense, but the human element is largely secondary. Methodology is precise and clinical. Nurses and researchers draw blood, take tissue samples, and monitor vital signs. Exposure levels, timing, and physiological responses are logged in meticulous charts. Hospitals become dual-purpose sites, centers of healing for the patient and laboratories for the government. Physicians perform procedures that are scientifically rigorous but ethically questionable, blurring the line between care and experimentation. Side effects vary. Some patients experience nausea, fatigue, or mild organ irritation. Others suffer long-term consequences: cancer, organ damage, infertility, or chronic illness. Many of these effects are delayed, emerging years or even decades after exposure, making direct attribution difficult but deeply concerning. Researchers often record outcomes clinically, without acknowledging the human distress or social consequences caused by the experiments. The ethical landscape is stark. Consent, when present, is often inadequate, and the balance of power between patient and medical authority is heavily skewed. Vulnerable populations are disproportionately targeted, reflecting a recurring Cold War pattern, prioritizing scientific and national objectives over individual autonomy. The experiments expose ordinary Americans to invisible threats under the guise of medical care or national interest. Despite the risks, the experiments provide valuable data. Scientists map radioactive pathways through the human body, refine safety standards, and improve medical responses to occupational and accidental exposure. Policies for nuclear workers, military personnel, and patients are informed by this clandestine research. Yet the moral compromise, human beings used as instruments without fully informed consent, remains a dark shadow over these achievements. The imagery is quietly disturbing. Patients lie in hospital beds, receiving injections or scans, unaware of the invisible particles circulating through their bodies. Charts, graphs, and laboratory notes grow fat with data while the human experience, pain, anxiety, uncertainty, is largely unrecorded. Nurses and doctors, tasked with both care and observation, occupy a liminal space between healer and scientist. Decades later, declassified files and investigative reports reveal the scale: hundreds, perhaps thousands of subjects, spanning multiple states and institutions. Public outrage follows, leading to congressional hearings, apologies, and compensation programs. Yet the personal impact, the suffering endured, the trust violated, cannot be fully reversed. In retrospect, the human radiation experiments epitomize the Cold War tension between knowledge and ethics. Ordinary citizens, often unaware, became participants in a massive, invisible experiment. Hospitals and laboratories, places of care, were transformed into arenas of observation. The experiments leave a lingering question: how far can science push boundaries before human dignity is irrevocably compromised? The Cold War ends, or at least, the intense nuclear and chemical paranoia that defined much of the mid-20th century begins to fade. But the experiments, the injections, the exposures, the invisible clouds drifting over cities and islands, leave a quiet, enduring legacy. By now, hundreds of human subjects, both volunteers and unwitting participants, have experienced the dark underbelly of government-sanctioned research. The knowledge gained is vast. The moral cost is harder to quantify. Looking back, the experiments form a spectrum. On one end, Operation Whitecoat demonstrates that ethical human experimentation is possible: volunteers, informed consent, and monitored risks. On the other, programs like Project 112, the Atomic City experiments, and San Antonio radiation studies illustrate a pattern of secrecy, coercion, and exploitation. In between, mustard gas tests, MKUltra, anthrax inoculations, and plutonium injections occupy morally gray spaces. Participants may have nominally consented, but informed understanding was limited and risk was often normalized. The experiments share a common feature. The human body becomes an instrument, a dataset, a vessel for observation. Soldiers, civilians, patients, and island residents are treated as living laboratories. Blistering chemicals, radioactive particles, hallucinogens, and bacteria coursed through human lives, not for curiosity alone, but in the service of national security. Knowledge was prioritized. Ethics were sometimes secondary. Consent, when it existed, was rarely fully informed. When it didn't, the subjects were often unaware of the peril they faced. Ethically, these experiments forced society to confront uncomfortable questions. How far can the state go in pursuit of knowledge? How can individual autonomy be respected when national security or scientific curiosity is invoked? How do we weigh human suffering against the potential benefits of research? In the decades following these programs, oversight mechanisms were created. Institutional review boards, informed consent protocols, and ethical codes governing human subject research. The shadow of these Cold War experiments loomed large in shaping modern research ethics. The human cost was tangible. Soldiers in mustard gas tests suffered burns and scarring. Atomic veterans carried radiation into old age. Islanders exposed during Project 4.1 faced long-term health consequences. Hospital patients unknowingly injected with radioactive isotopes experienced life-altering medical conditions. Volunteers in Whitecoat endured dangerous infections, though with knowledge and supervision. Every dataset has a human story, often silent, sometimes painful, and rarely fully acknowledged at the time. Yet there is another layer to the legacy: the psychology of secrecy and public trust. Decades of classified research created an atmosphere of suspicion. Communities exposed without knowledge, soldiers who were unknowingly tested, and patients misled in hospitals contribute to a historical record of institutional opacity. The eventual disclosure of these experiments led to public outrage, policy changes, and even compensation programs. But the impact on trust, between citizen and government, patient and physician, is harder to restore. From a scientific standpoint, the data from these experiments informed decades of medicine, military preparedness, and chemical and biological defense. Vaccines were developed. Fallout behavior was modeled. Cognitive effects of hallucinogens were studied. Radiation safety thresholds were established. In a cold, clinical sense, the research succeeded in producing knowledge that arguably saved lives or improved preparedness. In a human sense, it often failed to protect those who were part of the experiment itself. The imagery lingers: mushroom clouds, deserted test fields, fluorescent dust drifting across cities, sterile hospital rooms, soldiers standing in heat and chemical clouds, volunteers lying in beds infected with pathogens. Behind every chart, graph, or measurement lies a human life, often unacknowledged, sometimes suffering, sometimes resilient. Ultimately, the legacy of Cold War human experiments is dual: one of knowledge, one of moral caution. The era reminds us that scientific curiosity, military necessity, and national security can, if unchecked, encroach upon human dignity. It also demonstrates the value of transparency, consent, and oversight in research. These experiments are a history of risk, secrecy, courage, and, at times, exploitation. They remain a haunting, instructive chapter in the story of science and power. As you reflect on these decades of experimentation, imagine the invisible threads connecting mustard gas blisters, airborne particles, radiation burns, and hallucinogenic trips. The subjects may have differed, the substances changed, and the goals varied, But the lesson endures. Knowledge has a price, and human life has its own quiet, often invisible cost.